we'll try to go through these questions relatively quickly. So, for example, the first question on my guide isn't why did America join the Imperialist Club, but rather why were we late joining the Imperialist Club? So what that should mean to you is, like, if you remember World History 2, why did America join the Imperialist Club so much later than Europe? All right. And that looks terrible. So much later than Europe. That looks better. It's hard to write an American flag font, y'all. That's pretty fun font, isn't it? So why were we later? What were the reasons for America? Reasons for delay, which I know what I think they are, but like I said, I hadn't read the book in a while. So if you guys are, I imagine it's not in my World History 2 book. So what are some reasons? Who spotted the reasons pretty quickly? How come America isn't out conquering the world at a time when the Brits are doing it hardcore, the Germans are starting to do it, the Spanish are losing it, the French, they've been doing it.
Struggles over Reconstruction.
All right, so Reconstruction, exactly. First major issue. Reconstruction was divisive. So in other words, this took a lot of time. Reconstruction, good.
Building an industrial economy.
All right, building an industrial society. Yeah. So all of our capital, or most of our capital, was focused in really urbanization and in mechanization and transportation, right? And so, if you think about all the chapters we've covered so far, and then lastly, I think I heard someone mention it, the settlement of the West, right? So when you think about this, what this all adds up to is Americans didn't need to pay attention to the world, right? I remind you that this was a period in history when, we were self-sufficient. So normally countries don't go abroad looking for relations with other countries if we were self-sufficient. So I'll even write that down. So if you think about it this way, we were the world's largest internal market, which is kind of like double speak for self-sufficiency. Okay, self-sufficient. We produced all the goods that we needed and agriculture to feed ourselves, and we also, really didn't have to worry much about what was going on as far as goods and services from other countries. And we had two weak neighbors. I mean, I know that's kind of ugly to say, but hey, it's Canada and Mexico, right? Two weak neighbors and two giant oceans. So in many ways, America is like a continental fortress. We're so uniquely situated in history. The only real threat in American history, like Lincoln said, is from within. Like our only real danger to America is Americans. If we act stupidly to each other, then that will be a risk to our country. But we have these wonderful natural boundaries that protected us, and we're busy doing other stuff, and so I think your book is right on target there. Although I will say this, there were people in America who saw the scramble for Africa, and they recognized that what America had accomplished in our own continent was somewhat of an empire. Now, Jefferson had called it Empire of Liberty, right? So he didn't like to think of it as like actual imperialism. You guys that are Star Wars fans know that the Empire are the bad guys, right? So you don't really want to be called an empire. That's like, that implies not self-governing, but rather run by an emperor. When the Republic in Rome ended and the imperial phase started, that's kind of like the bad point in the history of the Roman Empire, arguably. So we didn't usually call the continental United States an empire. And if we did, we dressed it with some sort of feel-goodness like the Empire of Liberty. But Europeans looking at us considered what we had done to the Native Americans as sort of like what they were doing to other people too, So they didn't necessarily make a distinction between the two. So let's go now to why then did we join the Imperialist Club? So in other words, something has changed in America to make us interested in becoming imperial. At least some people. Keep in mind, I don't want to overgeneralize and say like all Americans. You know, I hate to say it, but most Americans are busy going around their lives and just surviving. So the people we're talking about here are not, you know, we're not talking about like the average man on the street, you know, but the folks that sort of make policy and make changes, they're interested in this. So who are these groups? Well, number one, and really the major cause, I think, are commercial interests, business interests. What happens is we were so successful in manufacturing that we overproduced. You understand? Not only did we overproduce manufactured goods, we were overproducing raw materials like sugar and cotton. And so what happened is that Americans who are in industry, in commerce, recognized we needed to trade with other countries a lot. Now, it wasn't that we hadn't traded some. You may recall we opened commerce with Japan, Matthew Perry. We opened commerce with China, the Treaty of Ongia. But we really hadn't focused our efforts on securing trade relations in the 19th century so far. That wasn't really our objective. So as you can see, during this period, there's going to be a massive shift in exports. That's the blue, right? So exports here, you know, what's that, dollars per barrel of whatever. And then that's going to skyrocket. And we're actually going to start having a trade surplus, you know, which is great. You know, I don't remember a trade surplus in American history, but here you're going to see that. So definitely be familiar with number one answer by a mile are businesses. Businesses want markets to be able to keep in mind. What's normally happens when you have overproduction is it cycles through and creates a panic. And they certainly had some panics in 1873 and in 93. So they're wanting to alleviate some of these overproduction problems. Number two is a fascinating one, but it kind of makes sense. The fellow on the right is William Randolph Hearst. The fellow on the left is Joseph Pulitzer. Now, if I had to compare the two, I would say Pulitzer was a more, what's the right word? More legitimate news publisher. Both Hearst and Pulitzer had massive, newspaper syndicates, but Pulitzer wasn't always sensationalistic. But by the late 1890s or mid 1890s, these two guys are now in a full-blown rivalry. And so the only way you got newspapers was to have the best headlines, to have the best stories. And so they would pay journalists to come up with these really fascinatingly riveting stories that would often be in serial format, meaning days after days after days. So you had to keep buying the paper to read the story. And nothing would sell papers more than the exploit of adventurers abroad. You know, this is the time when Africa was being explored, the time when Asia was being explored. Novelists were writing things like The Heart of Darkness. So, you know, any description of overseas adventure with particularly the quote unquote savage races. Also, war would be enormously popular for newspaper publishers. So particularly William Randolph Hearst are going to be looking for an opportunity to have an American war. I know that sounds awful, but you know, when people are opportunists, they don't necessarily care how it starts. So I would know that. Third, and you definitely want to know this guy. His name is Alfred Thayer Mahan, and he was a naval admiral who wrote a book that was one of the most significant works in American literature, or not literature, but historic nonfiction, called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And so his basic thesis was great navies make great nations. One of his greatest students of his work will be a fellow named Theodore Roosevelt, who will then go on and write a history of the American Navy. Teddy Roosevelt is going to publish a book as a graduate student at Harvard, and it's a great work of history called The History of the American Navy. And so these two guys, Alfred Thayer Mahan and Theodore Roosevelt, are firm believers in having a powerful Navy. And particularly, you might want to write down here, a two-ocean Navy. You should understand that that's significant, because if we're going to be patrolling two oceans, and that means that we're going to have the resources and the sort of locations necessary for a Pacific fleet. Keep in mind, these are steamships using coal. Number 4 is, and I need to switch number 5 down there for a minute. I think I'm a little bit out of order of your textbook, but that's okay. Number 4 is a really fascinating one if you've studied world history, because there is and it goes to the concept that's already popular in things like the Gospel of Wealth and Charles Graham Sumner's writings and teachings, the idea that the Western European race is the superior race. And thus, that's their argument, obviously. This is white supremacist talk. And what they believe as social Darwinists is that it is the actual moral duty of the elevated races, the superior races, quote unquote here. Again, I don't believe that for a minute, but their belief system, it's their moral duty to elevate and educate the inferior races. So they thought of themselves, and it's kind of the same way that the social Darwinists viewed people of poverty in America. It's kind of like savages kind of thing. So it's most embodied in a poem by Rudyard Kipling called The White Man's Burden. The white man's burden, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captive need. So here's the idea that you're not taking these people over, you're not exploiting these people, you're sacrificially helping these people, so that they'll be better, they'll be elevated. And so this is social Darwinism. It's, by the way, it's complete baloney. It's code for let's take them over and tell them how to do stuff. But it's nice to justify that, quote unquote, with pseudoscience. And then number 5, and I should have changed my number here. Somehow I forgot how to count. Number 5 are going to be religious folks, particularly this fella and his work, but also the Baptists and the Methodists. You're going to see, if you've ever been to a Southern Baptist church, particularly, you may have heard of like the Lottie Moon Christmas offering or the Annie Armstrong. So these were women missionaries who went to Manchu, China. And this is after the Opium War. The Opium War has forced China to end its 3 centuries of isolationism. And so now Westerners are starting to pour into China. And so Christian missionaries from America certainly want to be a part of that. They want to get in on that action, so to speak, of saving souls. The irony of that is that nothing looks more to me submissive, so to speak, than having a human riding on another human as a taxi cab, right? So that's what these ladies are doing. Now, these guys don't look particularly unhappy about it, but they're toting these ladies around Beijing on like a chair. And here you see a political cartoon of the period where, again, the same kind of thing. Like these are the natives toting around John Bull, the British leader, or the British symbol, Uncle Sam, of course. Back here you see the Kaiser symbol of the Germans. And the fella who's most sort of APUSH for us is this guy, Reverend Strong. Now, he was a Congregational, which you may recall as the Puritans. And he wrote a book where he basically argues social Darwinism. He believes that God, now keep in mind, the Brits have been talking this talk for 30 years when he writes this stuff. But he argues that God has shone a light on the Caucasian race, the Anglo-Saxon race, who are the purest. I mean, look at our skin, he would say. Look how pure we are. It's this kind of garbage that really it gets under my skin, literally, because people use this for centuries to justify exploitation. Yeah, it's the idea that somehow a race of people, it's the kind of stuff that racism can be very subtle. And when it's coming from a pastor who's saying it's our moral duty to lift up, So again, I don't think that there's anything wrong with Christian missionaries traveling around the world and wanting to spread their religious beliefs. But when you refer to yourself as the purest and highest of civilization, that's taking it a step further than simply wanting to spread the gospel. I think it's during this period when Jesus turned into a white guy, apparently, because that's really the kind of the propaganda these guys are going to teach. But regardless, by this period, there's a lot of pressure on allowing Americans to travel, allowing Americans to visit China, allow Americans to go to Japan, and certainly the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so during this period, you're going to see a fairly, okay, I did have one other. Now, let's call this number 6. This is, to me, this is the, this is a sort of like the one that's much more subtle, but much more, this is the Turner thesis. I know I only labeled the E, but I separated social Darwinism from religion. And the reason for that is that while the two are often interlinked, keep in mind, this is kind of like social Darwinism here. You did not have to be a religious person to be a social Darwinist. Yeah, they're not, right. It's not causation, but it's certainly correlation between the two. That's exactly right. So if we can add a sixth here, there is a psychological impact to the closing of the frontier. And I certainly have been hinting at this with Turner's thesis a lot. Okay. Now, I realize that this you're going to be present with me to help amend my PowerPoint. So that's awesome for you, right? So I want to show you James Blaine. Now, normally when I mention James Blaine in this class, I'm talking about the leader of the stalwarts, a U.S. senator who was a sort of associated with corruption and, was a candidate for president, but unfortunately for him, was unsuccessful because it had too many skeletons in his closet. Remember the Romanism and rebellion of Cleveland's first term. So let me pull up a slide of him, so to speak, and then I'll be able to show it to you. I hope. Maybe. Looks like computer's been funky today, and looks like it's going to continue to be. So I won't use that one. I'll use this one. Sometimes it's just quicker to do it this way. So Blaine is going to be, as you might imagine, a Republican, right? And for Blaine, he is going to want to create a more favorable relationship with Latin America, okay? And so we're going to call this the Big Sister policy, okay? Big Sister. Now he, as you might recall, was a Republican, okay? And he is going to be the Secretary of State under both President Harrison and President Arthur before him. So he is an active Secretary of State, and he wants to develop a relationship with Latin America. Now, keep in mind, the Monroe Doctrine is still in effect. And so he wants the Latin American countries to start trading with America, like routinely trading with America. And so this is what leads to something called the Pan-American Conference, which means we're going to start working with the Latin American countries, sort of like friends and neighbors. Now, of course, he wants the Latin Americans to become sort of dependent on us and us to have an influence in Latin America. But at the same time, this is often seen as not overt imperialism. In other words, we're not trying to take over Latin America. We're not hurting Latin America. It's more like trying to gain a big sister influential relationship. So it's not really big brother. It's more like big sister, if that makes sense. And so it's actually called the Big Sister policy. You might say this is the beginning, the start of what is today something in American history called the Organization of American States, which is actually interesting to me because it's located directly across the street from the White House. So the Organization of American States isn't something he creates. I don't want to tell you that, but what it does is it lays the foundation for what will ultimately be a long-term relationship, okay, with Latin America. So keep in mind, Latin America has been through dozens of, here's the OAS's symbol. I'll show you where the OAS building looks like in Washington, D.C. It's literally, like I said, right across the street from the White House. So if you are walking past the White Houses where they have the Christmas tree, this is on the other side. So it's kind of cool. Right here. Oh, not right there. Awesome. So anywho, that doesn't happen yet. It doesn't happen right away. But today there is an agency, a country organization called the Organization of American States. Your book is giving you a little context here by saying down the road, this is going to pay off big time. Like this is going to work out for us where we're going to have a friendly relationship with all of these different capitals down here in Latin America. So I don't want you to think the Pan Am Conference produces this, but it lays the foundation for this. So this is like in the future, this is going to emerge. Okay. Now, during this period, you're going to see Americans start to get a little more cantankerous. Let me see how this is showing up on y'all's presentation. I can't tell what it looks like. I never can tell for sure. Okay, you can see all. Good. So we've got places where America considers areas that are of our interest. And so these are more like kerfluffles than they are like major incidents. But it looks like Americans are kind of like chomping at the bit for a fight. Okay. So, for example, the Germans are going to be in Samoa, right? We were both interested in Samoa. If you go back up here, you can see all of these areas are areas that America, particularly the 50s, you see the Howland and Baker Island already here. Here you see American Samoa. So we were interested in Samoa, and the Germans were interested in Samoa. We told the Germans that they had to get out, and because the Germans were in the midst of potential conflict with Britain, they leave. Okay? Now, they leave the one we wanted. Eventually, the other one becomes independent. So we're going to acquire American Samoa in 1899. You may know of American Samoa, you may not. So that's actually an American possession today, territory. Then a group of Italian soldiers or sailors are down in New Orleans. And, you know, back then, Italian nativism was kind of ugly, and they got murdered. They were killed. Yeah, well, they were Italians, and they were in uniform, I think, if memory serves. And the Italians demanded justice, and we paid them off. You know, we're like, okay, our bad. We gave them what's called an indemnity. Valparaiso incident was really embarrassing. And this is the stuff that kind of opened the eyes of the American, like, sort of naval gurus. So Valparaiso is a port in Chile, and we had demanded the honor of our naval. We had lost 2 sailors. They were killed in the city, and we were going to like demand that they salute the flag and, you know, like uphold our honor. Our honor had been offended, you know. And then we got to looking at it, and we realized that Chile was actually in a better position to fight us than we were. Like Chile had a better Navy than America had. So it's kind of hard to imagine, but the Chilean Navy was a greater threat to the United States than the American Navy, so-called Navy, than was to Chile. So we backed off. We were like, okay, we better not do that. We're like, dang, forget that. So that argument kind of died down. And then you had seal hunters who were, you know, these Canadians were kind of coming over into Alaskan territory, and ultimately we negotiated. Now, what does all of this have to do with anything? Well, not a lot, except for the fact that it shows that we were kind of getting our fire up. We were kind of arrogant, and any little provocation, it looked like Americans wanted to go to a fight. But then it got to be actually serious. So as much as these things are kind of interesting, I don't think they'll ever appear on an AP exam other than, you know, that we got in a few kind of kerfluffles. But then there's this. And this is one of the more interesting moments, I think, in American history. It's really important. And obviously, Grover Cleveland had a lot else on his mind in his second term besides cancer of the mouth and the Panic 1893 and the Pullman strike. But one of the things that was interesting that Cleveland took the time to deal with. Now, you may notice that his Secretary of State is the guy who busted the Haymarket Square. All right? No, I take that back. He was the prosecutor is the best way to put it. Busted is not the right word, but he only was the governor of Illinois who went after the Haymarket anarchists. And so he was a tough guy already. Cleveland was a tough guy. So here is Venezuela. And here is British Guyana. And gold was found on this border. And the Brits declared that it was in British Guyana territory. The Venezuelans declared it was in Venezuela. And if you understand here, this is the Western Hemisphere. So Cleveland said, you have to the Brits, you have to get out of Venezuela under the Monroe Doctrine. Cleveland through Olney, the Secretary of State. And he told the Brits that America was in charge here. Now the Brits were like, yeah, right. Keep in mind, this is Victorian Britain at the height of its power. This is Britain from Cape to Cairo, where they've taken over every part of Africa that's worth anything almost. They own India entirely. And they're like, you're going to tell us what to do in Venezuela? But this is where world of events make sense. Britain had gotten into an incident in Africa, in South Africa, called the Boer War. Britain was busy fighting the Dutch settlers. And you don't have to know all this world history, but the Brits were it's called the Anglo-Boer War. They were fighting a war with Dutch farmers of South Africa who've been living there for over 150 years. The Brits wanted to take over South Africa. And the Kaiser, this is Kaiser Wilhelm the First, the Kaiser sent a letter to the Boers, a telegram congratulating them. And the Brits were like, and so if you do the math here, it should become pretty readily available. This is only 20 years away from World War I. So Britain and Germany are shaping up to be enemies. It's pretty clear. Germany is one of the major enemies, or rivals in Africa, in the South Pacific, and of course on the continent. And so during this period, the Brits agree to allow the Americans to settle the Venezuela dispute. And they kind of split it in the middle, so to speak. And this is a really great moment because keep in mind, the Democrats, that's who Cleveland is, historically had always been anti-British, all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. But once the Irish became Democratic voters, then routinely the Democrats were anti-British, right? They called it twisted in the lion's tail. They would talk smack about Britain. You think back about the problems leading into Polk's administration about 40 years before, 50 years before. But now Britain recognizes that they're going to need friends, particularly as Germany has made friends with Austria-Hungary and Italy. You may know about the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. And they realize also that America, it's probably better to reconcile with us as a country than it is to continue to have this sort of animosity. And so there's a French word for what happens called the Great Rapprochement, which is just basically the Great Reconciliation, the Great Makeup. And since then, to the present, if you were to ask who America's most important strategic ally is, it has been the country of Great Britain since World War I, or maybe since the Venezuela crisis. So we today have what's called a special relationship with Great Britain. The Prime Minister of Britain is usually the first foreign leader the American president talks to. And even to this day, that's a very, very important relationship. Okay, so that's the Great Rapprochement, the Great Makeup. Be familiar with that, all right? And so the reason, of course, is the Monroe Doctrine, but it was resolved through a sort of mediation. They agreed to kind of split the difference. And then ultimately, this turned out to be very helpful for our long-term future. But really, when we start talking about imperialism outside of the continental United States, you almost always have to start with Hawaii. Now, I'd feel remiss to not play you a song about the settlement of Hawaii. And so I want to do that. So I'm going to go to this period. Not that I care that you are knowledgeable of the Eagles or not, but I do want you to be aware of the idea that the first settlers to almost anywhere from America were frequently missionaries, okay? And so he mentions that just like the missionaries did so many years ago. And so the first group to come to Hawaii are the missionaries, and I mean early on. So you're talking about the 1820s, not much longer after our country was a country, you start to have this first group. So if you're thinking about the process, the first folks to stop in Hawaii are these New England missionaries, like from Providence, Rhode Island, for example, among other places. And so once they settled there, their people, like their children and their children's children, wanted to become successful. And probably the greatest example of a successful descendant of these missionaries is a guy named J. Sanford Dole, D-O-L-E, Dole. And so he was the grandson of missionaries, and he is going to establish a massive plantation in Hawaii of sugar and pineapple. And so you've probably heard of the Dole Fruit Company, right? Yeah, well, that's this guy. That's his family, his sort of dynastic. The problem is, oh, and by the way, there's another group that stops in Hawaii as well, and they use this island, the American Navy does, as a refueling station. So as you're sailing across the Pacific, you'd have to stop and get coal. And so Hawaii and Midway, these two islands here, or set of islands, were used to store coal. So you would have that to refuel your ships. So first the missionaries and sort of like the early American Navy folks came. Then the descendants of the missionaries often were successful businessmen in the case of Dole. So I want you to know that. Well, this depicts the Queen of Hawaii as being propped up by American military forces. We declared it a protectorate, and thus no other country could take it over. So even though Hawaii was a kingdom with its own government, it became a protectorate as it under our sphere of influence under economic rule. So who was this ruler of Hawaii? Her name, and I would definitely want you to be familiar with it, is Queen Lulukalani. And Queen Lulukalani said, we're not welcoming you Americans. Like we didn't invite you to come into our country. You're not welcome here. And so that prompted a group of Americans to sponsor what's called the Bayonet Constitution. All right. And so this Bayonet Constitution would allow a group of Americans to serve as the military of Hawaii. Now, keep in mind, that's without the permission of the Queen, and that's why they forced her at bayonet. But unfortunately for Dole, in 1890, the good Republican that he was, put a tariff on all imported goods. William McKinley and the McKinley tariff. Congress passed that. Well, that applied to his sugar plantations. That applied to his pineapple. All of the goods coming in from Hawaii were now going to be under a tariff. And so the American businessmen in Hawaii did not want that. They were like, well, how can we get around Hawaii having tariffs on it? Well, I know we can make Hawaii part of America. If Hawaii is part of America, we don't have to have tariffs on our products anymore. So they then backed a coup d'etat against Queen Lulukalani. America overthrew the Queen. Now, we didn't shoot her, but we removed her from power and declared our country, Hawaii rather, the country of Hawaii as a republic. Now, keep in mind, this was not representative of the Hawaiian people. The Hawaiian people didn't vote for this. And so then Sanford Dole, keep in mind, he's the guy who owns this company, says, let's apply for American statehood. Now, before we get to the American statehood part, though, I would like to point out this is during President Cleveland's presidency, 1894. Cleveland sends a commission and rejects Hawaiian statehood or Hawaii's annexation because he sends a commission to find out, well, is this what the Hawaiians wanted? So while Cleveland didn't always do things I agree with, he was a fair play kind of guy. And so when Dole asked for statehood or asked for territorial status, and Lulukalani, by the way, resists this. Nonetheless, Cleveland rejects it. However, in the midst of the Spanish-American War, William McKinley does not have these compunctions. William McKinley, who is now President McKinley, accepts Hawaii as an American state or as American territory, and then soon it will become it won't become soon because keep in mind when Pearl Harbor occurs in 1941, Hawaii is still a territory at that point. Like Hawaii wasn't a state when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. So I guess the best way you can conclude this is to say that Hawaii was taken over by the United States. This was not an action supported by the native Hawaiian people. Now, Dole, who has a splendid beard, these guys all had great beards back then. Dole would argue that he was Hawaiian. He was a grandson of an American missionary. And so he's second generation Hawaiian, he would argue. But the native Pacific Islander people that were Hawaiian rejected this. Unfortunately for them, that didn't prevail. Now, over time, there is still a debate in Hawaii. Now, most Hawaiians seem pretty comfortable with American statehood now, but there are some Hawaiians who we might consider nationalistic. And so periodically when films are set in Hawaii, I remember there was a movie that they made in Hawaii and they cast Emma Stone as a Hawaiian. And if you know who Emma Stone is, she's a great actress, but man, she can't pull that off. She doesn't seem like an ethnic Hawaiian at all. So there are still like sensitive issues involving ethnicity with Hawaii. And, President Obama lives in Hawaii. My favorite singer, Eddie Vedder, lives in Hawaii. I guess I've read somewhere that Hawaii may be the highest standard of living, highest cost of living state if you want to do well in Hawaii. But nonetheless, that settles our acquisition of Hawaii. So that shifts our gear now full-throated to Cuba. Now, I haven't mentioned Cuba since the Austin Manifesto. So if you go way back to before the Civil War, in 1854, a group of American Southerners tried to acquire Cuba from Spain while they were in Belgium. And then the news broke and they didn't succeed. But Cuba, lies 90 miles off the American coast. Now, I have a cartoon for you to enjoy here. This miniature fella here is William McKinley as a Taylor president, right? And you can see here the argument for rational expansion. Uncle Sam's getting too big, right, for his britches. So he needs to have new clothes to expand because he keeps growing, under President McKinley. But the problem in Cuba has to do with the country of Spain. Now, Spain, if you think about Spain, we haven't mentioned Spain since the Louisiana Purchase, I guess, when Napoleon took Louisiana from Spain. But there are real problems down in Cuba over misrule. And it has to do with stuff like this. See, let me go ahead and give you some actual notes to give you the background here to what's going on. So background to Cuban independence, right? Background to Cuban independence. We'll go with that. And so what had happened is the Cubans had longed for self-government, okay? And so in 1895, the Cubans revolt against Spanish misrule. And what that means is the Spanish, by this point in history, have kind of become an absentee parent. And so they're kind of governing Cuba sort of half-heartedly, but they're not. The people of Cuba are suffering terribly as a result of this. Meanwhile, American tariffs have broken or damaged badly or crippled Cuban sugar production. And in other words, we were now in America producing our own sugar, and we had tariffs on foreign sugar, on Cuban sugar. Okay, and so when this happened, they call them insurrectos, the rebels. The insurrectos began destroying Cuban sugar cane plantations and fields. So they're like burning up the sugar crop as an act of resistance. Okay, and so Americans are interested in this. Americans were like, well, we should probably pay attention because Americans had heavy investments in Cuba. Keep in mind, Cuba is 90 miles off our coast, right? You had traded with Cuba, but also we were also sympathetic to the idea of self-government, the democratic values, right? And your expansionist types wanted Spain out so we could control the isthmus of Central America. Okay? We wanted this one more European power gone, and so we would have a greater amount of control. Keeping in mind the fact that as long as Cuba was in violent conflict, this threatened travel through this region, right? Well, the problem was, I should probably italicize that. Less weird looking. The problem was the Spanish sent this guy. I guess I should put a picture of Butcher Wheelair. Butcher Wheelair is just one of those guys in history who was really the absolute worst person imaginable for this assignment. Okay, so he was sent by the Spanish over, and his idea of dealing with this is what we would call pacification, which means teach the insurrectos a lesson. Whoops, excuse me. So I'm going to show you a cartoon of it rather than him. So here's one they call him the Great Wheelair Ape. All right. So this guy's theory of how to solve this problem was to put the people in concentration camps, in terrible concentration camps. And while they were in those concentration camps, most of the people were under starvation-like conditions. And those are pictures not of Jews from the Holocaust, but of Cubans from the camps, the concentration camps. Absolutely a similar. Well, I don't know for certain, and I've read Wheelair. I don't know that he was trying to exterminate, I guess is the best way to put it. I don't think he was trying to exterminate the Cuban people, let's say like the Germans were. But the labor camp, definitely similar. And, you know, the Brits did this too in Kenya. So here you can see Wheeler depicted as this sort of terrible person. Now, this would be the kind of things that would appear in the yellow press. But these were terrible. This is scandalous, you know. So people see this stuff. Now, the yellow press are then going to step up their game. And I do want to teach you a word that the first time I mentioned it today, and that is jingoism. So there's a word that you guys should know called nationalism by now, which is pride in one's country, in its traditions and its past. You know, nationalism is supporting our country's interests. It's often a synonym to patriotism, right? Well, jingoism is an extreme form of nationalism, an extreme form of patriotism, to the point where it's a chauvinistic type of your country can do no wrong. So what you're going to start seeing here is both of these publishers are going to start running lots of stories about Cuba because, you know, it's interesting. And there are going to be stories, for example, about women being strip searched by Spaniards. And very famously, William Randolph Hearst sends the great artist Frederick Remington down to Havana and tells him, find pictures of the atrocity, you furnish the pictures, and I'll start the war. All right. So in other words, they're going to try to create a war in Cuba. You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. Meanwhile, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy is a young man named Theodore Roosevelt, and he sees this as a perfect opportunity for America to flex on a weak country. Keep in mind, Spain is very weak in the 19th century by this point. And Touart thinks that we need to get in a fight. He's a kind of warmonger. So what happens is the federal government sends a battleship. Well, before we get to the battleship, I'll hold off on that for a minute. So during this story, an embarrassing event happens for Spain. And this is published in the yellow press as well. And it is called the Delhomme letter. Okay, so the ambassador from Spain had cabled back to Spain a letter or telegram saying what his observation of William McKinley was. And this is what he said. He is a weak, bitter, bitter, B-I-D-D-R, for the admiration of the crowd, a would-be politician who tries to leave open the door behind himself while keeping on good terms with the Jingos. Now, guys, that's an absolutely accurate assessment of William McKinley. All right, like that is true what William McKinley was. But it's one thing for us to view our president as a politician vying for the support of the crowd, right? It's another for a European to say that about our president, who's their ambassador, right? And so when this letter breaks, people are like, he's a scumbag. Ironically, Theodore Roosevelt gets angry that McKinley won't start a war and says he has a backbone of a chocolate eclair. He says that publicly. So TR. Now, and this is the first time we've ever mentioned TR, and boy, am I going to enjoy talking about him. But he is an important family. He's a Knickerbocker from Dutch descendants from New York. He has a lovely estate, born to wealth, but his father had succeeded at everything in life but one thing, that was politics. And so TR wanted to kind of vindicate his father by becoming a great politician. So he's graduated from Harvard, and he's written several key books, and he gets a plum assignment to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So back then, the Navy was a cabinet level. So there was the Secretary of the Navy and then the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So he gets a really important job, right? It's a political appointment. And he believes if I can talk like TR, he believes in the fighting races. Okay, he believes in that the way to test your manliness is through battle, and the way to test the manliness of a country is through war. Now I know that sounds awful. He's a warmonger, but at that time in history, that was the martial feeling. The sense of military strength meant virility and power and a strong nation state. Plus, he and another guy, Mahan, had just written this book about navies making great nations. So he is going to quit his job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and volunteer to become an Army officer. And so Theodore Roosevelt, without any military service, is going to create the first U.S. volunteer cavalry, otherwise known as the Rough Riders. And he is going to create this out of whole cloth. And it is made up of his friends from out west. It's made up of polo players from New York, his friends at Harvard. It's made up of his friends that are cowboys. Now, TR's been through some tough stuff. His first wife has died, and he went out west to be a cowboy. His entire herd died in a blizzard. He once captured 2 outlaws and put them on a raft and sailed them down to a town at gunpoint. So he's lived a very fascinating life. Keep in mind, TR, when he was born, was, by all accounts, a wimp. He had terrible asthma, crippling asthma. He's terribly nearsighted, like almost blind. And his father had bought him an 1870s version of a gym, like a weight set. And he had worked out so much that his chest was the size of a barrel. He was a huge chested guy. TR was not fat. He became a wrestler and a rower at Harvard. And so he actually defeated asthma by expanding his lung capacity. So he actually grew out of asthma through his own willpower. And so TR is one of those rare people in history who was both a jock, right, like a real athlete, but also a brilliant intellectual. Like he was an academic. One of his colleagues said, TR, you could give TR a book to read, and he would come at dinner, and he would come back at breakfast and have read the whole book and could tell you any part of it. So by all accounts, TR was absolutely brilliant. But he was committed to this idea that the way that America would know it's a great nation is by defeating people through power, right? And so the Secretary of the Navy didn't even want to leave him alone because he was afraid he would start a war, all right? So nonetheless, he's going to quit and create this group, the Rough Riders. Well, in the meantime, before the war starts, the United States sends a warship down to Havana Harbor to protect Americans. So if the violence in Cuba spreads, the warship will be where the Americans will go to. Like it'll be like their refuge. And in the middle of the harbor, the ship blows up. It just explodes. Now, that is straight out of the desire that Hearst would have for what a war could be, right? When the Maine blows up, the newspapers run over and over again that this was the cause of Spain. Spain blew up this ship, the USS Maine, right? And so you had amazingly funny headlines like, remember the Maine and to hell with Spain. Now, I do want to tell you folks, guys, Spain has no interest in getting into a war with the United States. Like Spain does not want to do that at all. And Spain did not blow up this ship. This ship was blown up, as other ships have been blown up before, by the bad design of American warships of putting the gunpowder room and gunpowder stores beside the room that has coal in it. Right. And so the coal has coal dust. And if you don't know about coal dust, what it does is it's actually flammable. So like the air can catch on fire if you're not careful because the dust can catch a spark. So what becomes very clear, and it takes an American admiral years later to fully discover this, is that the ship self-exploded. It exploded by a boiler explosion or by a coal explosion by the gun room. But at the time, this is all the American journalists needed to say, well, look what the Spanish did. This is all TR needed to say, look at what the Spanish did, right? And so the blowing up of the Maine is going to be the event that causes McKinley to have to ask, should we go to war? Now, McKinley, who's not at all, it seems, uncomfortable taking over other places. Remember, this guy who takes over Hawaii, decides that, he has to pray on it. And finally, he decides that, that we have to declare war. Okay. His Secretary of State, Hay, will call it a splendid little war. Okay. So McKinley is going to decide it probably for political reasons. It's certainly possible that he's sympathetic with the Cubans, the Cuban rebels. It's possible that he believed the Maine was blown up by Spain, although it seems unlikely. But what is very likely is he's concerned that if he doesn't, and by the way, this is a hugely popular war, meaning lots of people want this war. And so he's concerned politically that if he doesn't do it, then the Democrats might have a talking point in the next election. Like he didn't, save our country when we were attacked by the Spanish. So he decides in 1898, April 1898, that we're going to go to war. Now, before we go any further on the war, I do want to add in one little thing here, and I think I have it later, but let me double check. Yeah, it's down here, actually here. So mentioned here is something called the Teller Amendment. So I'm going to mention it here too. All right. And so one of the things that's fascinating about this war is that the U.S. guarantees Cuban independence when we win. So in other words, we tell ourselves that we are not fighting this war to take over Cuba. Europeans were like, yeah, right. Okay. But in fact, this is true. It's an amendment to the Declaration of War. I should point this out. Amendment to the Declaration of War. See, keep in mind, back then Congress passed declarations of war. And what it said, this Senator Teller, that we aren't going to take over Cuba. We expect we'll win after we're done winning. Now, I should also remind you something else. OBT dub. Spain removed Wheelair and the camps and agreed to Cuban demands. So this is one of those wars that never had to happen because the Spanish were like, yeah, we'll do what you're asking. You know what I mean? But at that point, the ship had sailed. We were, so it's pretty clear from everything I've read, the Spanish had no interest at all in getting in a war. They didn't blow up the Maine. They realized that they'd made a bad mistake in these death camps. And, even Delhomme resigned because of the protests. But it didn't matter. We're at war now. Now, I should go back and mention TR. Now, before TR quits, so here's February, right? If you look out here, actually, it's before that. It's back in the spring, before April. TR will send a telegram to this guy, Commodore Dewey. And this is while Secretary Long was out of the office. So what TR sends him as Secretary of the Navy, or Assistant Secretary of the Navy, is a telegram saying, in February, we're on the brink of war. Be ready, right? So Dewey, who's at Hong Kong, gets his ships all fired up and coaled up and ready to go. So when the war is voted on, Dewey is going to sail into Manila Bay and pull off one of the greatest singular naval victories in history. He's going to do what naval and military historians call capping the T. If you can cap the T as a Navy commander, what this means is, imagine this is the T would be like the Spanish Navy, right? So their guns are pointed to either side of my hand. Well, the American Navy gets above it, which means all of their guns are pointed down and none of the Spanish guns can point at the American guns. You understand? The entire side of the U.S. ships are shooting at the Spanish ships. So you're capping the T. And that is, if you can pull that off, it means they can't do anything. They're just obliterated. They are sitting ducks. That's right. Exactly. And so his 6 ships, right, blow up the 10 Spanish ships completely. They kill 400 Spaniards. Not a single American dies. So they sink 10. Now, these are old ships. Don't get me wrong. They're not like the best of ships, but I'll put that data over here. So let me bring that in. Yeah, it's crazy. So you would have thought somebody would have gotten hurt, right?
Yes.
So Dewey's six-ship, I almost don't even want to call it a fleet, sank Spanish 10 ships, killing 400 while suffering no casualties. So in an instant, the Spanish are removed from Asia. All right. Just like that. They're obliterated. Now keep in mind, Spain had the Philippines since King Philip. So you're talking about like the 1500s. We had not really considered the Philippines. TR did. You understand? We're fighting a war to liberate where? Cuba, and the first place we attack is the Philippines. That's TR. That's totally his vision. And we did have a Pacific fleet, and so that really worked. And Commodore Dewey is going to become a household name, like he's going to become an American hero. Here he is here. Dewey smashes Spain's fleet. No, that's not Thomas Dewey who ran against Harry Truman. No, that's a different. That's different Dewey. This Dewey is going to be dead and gone by that point. So I put this picture up here because we're going to go to Cuba tomorrow. But I want you to understand. Here's Napoleon. Here's Julius Caesar, and here's McKinley. And then look at this terrible picture. I have good friends of mine who are Filipinos. This is the sort of epitome of racism, right? To depict a Filipino as this sort of black-faced, frond-wearing savage kind of thing, right? So if you're looking down here at the bottom, is McKinley going to become the imperialist? Well, herein lies the problem. And guys, this is almost a shameful moment as you're going to get. Dewey is going to have to defeat his Marines are going to have to fight to liberate the Philippines from the Spanish. But they're ably assisted by a Chinese Filipino named Emilio Aguinaldo, this guy. He's going to lead sort of like the Filipino rebels with the Americans to defeat the Spanish. Yay, right? But take a look at Philippines Independence Day. 1946. So it's like 1898, 19, what? So we're going to get involved in one of the most devastating wars in American history, which I don't even know if your book mentions. And it's called the American Filipino War. Because after we defeat Spain, the Filipinos are going to be like, hey, we want our independence. And unfortunately, the U.S. is going to say that the Philippines are not ready for self-government. What is particularly concerning to McKinley is fear of foreign power taking over the Philippines. So in other words, if we don't take over the Philippines, Japan might, Britain might, France might, right? So this means then that we are going to get into a decades-long war. This war lasts from, let me look up the exact dates here. I don't want to tell you wrong. The American-Filipino War, I don't think even, the book may mention it a little bit, but it lasts from 1899 to 1902. Okay. Well, that's longer than the Spanish-American War by a lot, you know. And I want to get the casualties right because it's way more casualties than the Spanish-American War has. In terms of killed or wounded, there are, I'll just copy this completely. I usually search this out pretty well. Take a look at these stats. Pretty sad stuff. So in terms of, we're on the left. We're America on the left here. And if you do that math, that's somewhere between, now keep in mind, the numbers vary because of disease. It's hard to tell exactly how many people died during a war back then because of like I said, diseases. So U.S. casualties. And Filipino casualties. I'll spell that right now. Oh, well, that's a good place to stop, isn't it? And we'll come back to this war and the rest of the war in Cuba. So definitely be aware of this. Because again, war does terrible things like killing tens of thousands of people from sicknesses and famine. But this war is far more terrible than the Spanish-American War and usually unmentioned in history. So I want to make sure you guys know about that. Thousands of Americans killed. Okay, well, have a great day, and we'll see you guys on the flip side.